Hello and welcome to Real Crime Profile. This is Jim Clemente, retired FBI profiler, former New York City prosecutor, and currently writer and producer on CBS's Criminal Minds. And I'm here today with
Laura Richards. I'm the co-founder and director of Paladin National Stalking Advocacy Service, and author of The Dash and the book Policing Domestic Violence, and I'm also a criminal behavioural analyst.
Well, it's great to be here again with you, Laura, and today is another special episode where we're going to talk about answering listener questions. So why don't you start with the first one?
Yeah, well, the first one is probably the most over-asked question that I certainly get, and probably you get as well, Jim. So
I think so.
it's how do you become a profiler? So one of our listeners has said that profiling and forensic psychology has always interested them, and that. So I'm going to throw that to you, Jim, and you can answer it first off.
Well, the fact that this listener has had a history of working, well, she has a BA and an MA in international relations and has worked in the DEA, U.S. Marshal Service, and now at FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, but she's only 24. So she's at the beginning of her career, and she'd love suggestions on how someone of her age would go about shifting into a career type as both of ours. Well, first of all, I'll say that Laura and I's careers are and our career paths have been very different. So I'll answer for me, and then Laura can answer for herself. I am a criminal behavioral analyst. I'm a law enforcement agent, a former prosecutor, and my career path was not anything that I really planned out. It sort of happened as it happened. So basically, in order to be an FBI profiler, you have to have a college degree, and it certainly helps to have a graduate degree in terms of getting into the FBI, but then trying to get into the behavioral analysis unit where the profilers work in the FBI, it's very competitive. So you really have to have either a master's or a doctorate degree in order to get in there. But only after you've had 5 to 10 years of experience working cases, actually investigating crimes. So at 24, having been a DEA employee, I don't know what your job was in the DEA, but obviously that would determine a lot. If you've been a DEA agent, that's one thing because it's in the Department of Justice. It has exactly the same security clearances. So it would be very easy to go from being a DEA agent to an FBI agent. But if it wasn't as an agent, then you want to get on the agent track. You want to be able to, you have to pass the physical exams and the educational exams, as well as a series of interviews, background investigations, polygraph, etc. Those are all just the standards you have to jump through. But once you get into the FBI as an agent, you have to work violent crime cases, sexual crime cases. You have to be involved in major cases. You have to do everything you can to prove yourself as a hard worker. Because in the FBI, there are over 13,000 agents, but there are only about 25 to 30 FBI profilers. There's a lot of competition to get those jobs. In fact, you're going to have to compete against hundreds, if not thousands, of other people who want to get into that unit. So it's something that is a difficult path, but the fact that I could do it means that you could do it too if you set your mind to it, if you get the right experience, and maybe go back and get an additional degree in an area that like forensic psychology. But that is the career choice that Laura Richards made, and she can tell you a little bit about that.
Yeah, and this also picks up one of our second questions as well, which is about being a criminal psychologist. So, I mean, the first thing to say is in the UK, in particular, Jim sort of talked about the US, but in the UK, there's no real career pathway or career structure, and it was something I was trying to bring in to New Scotland Yard. But certainly, I worked on what was called the behavioural science unit when I first started on it, which then became the sexual offences section at New Scotland Yard. And we were trying to bring in a career structure, which didn't happen in the end, actually, sadly. And again, when I was running the homicide prevention unit. But in terms of if I take the psychology bit first of all, certainly getting a BSc in psychology, so an undergrad in psychology that in the UK that's BPS accredited. So that basically means the British Psychological Society, they have courses that are accredited. And so you would firstly want to get your undergraduate, and then you would want to get your master's. And again, just checking that it's BPS accredited. And then a PhD if you want to go into the clinical side, clinical psychology. And again, it's determining what exactly it is that you would like to do. What's your passion and what's your interest? And that's what I always say to students and people that ask me this question, that, do you want to work with victims? Do you want to work with perpetrators? Do you want to work in research, in criminological psychology? There's lots of different avenues and lots of different types of work. Do you want to work in a prison setting, for example, or do you want to work in law enforcement in terms of the police? And if it's the police side, I started life really as a behavioural analyst. So there's different ways of doing it, but that still doesn't guarantee you to become a behavioural profiler. So that's the sad thing in many senses, that you can't say do A, B, C and D and then you get to E. But I always say just follow your passion, follow the things that interest you, which is what I've done across my career. And actually it's been very organic. And as Jim said, there was never really a 10-year or 20-year plan. I followed my interest. So profiling stranger rape, murder and abduction cases to start off with, and then being curious about how reactive that process is, and then being headhunted to profile interpersonal violence, so domestic violence, which I then learned I wanted to group that with sexual violence. So you can probably see I followed the work rather than followed promotion or a career pathway of sorts. And from that, I started to create a risk assessment model. And, it's a very organic process, and I followed what's interested me. And I would certainly advise, anyone who's thinking about a career change to follow what interests you and to think about which universities or colleges you go to make sure that they're accredited courses. To volunteer, so you can work for a charity, for example, if you wanted to get experience of working with victims or with perpetrators. So there's no one easy answer to how do you become a profiler per se, or how do you become a criminal behavioural analyst, or indeed a psychologist.
But we've given you some ideas of how we did it, and hopefully you can figure out your own path there. It can definitely be done, and we wish you luck on that journey. So the next question is from S, and she says, wanted to reach out to you and ask if you had any suggestions surrounding my passionate desire to bring my social media experience, 8+ years, along with my psychology degree, to a company where I could make an impact in a company's fight to protect the innocent. I initially went to college to become a criminal psychologist, but life took a different turn for me, and 20 years and 3 kids later, I find myself still yearning, still utterly passionate about pouring all my strength and energy into this field. Would very much appreciate any direction you may be able to provide at all. Thank you. Thank you for your fantastic podcast. So Laura, what do you think about this?
I mean, again, I'd answered it a little bit in the first question, is that, if you have an interest in the psychology side, certainly, it depends whether it was a BSc and it was BPS accredited, or whether it's a master's, that you have. But certainly looking at, potentially your pathway, if you wanted to use the social media side, it really depends on exactly what it is that you would like to do. I'm not exactly sure what company you work for, so it's difficult to say,
right,
because there's so many different avenues you can go down. So it's difficult to give an answer without knowing the full detail of what it is that interests this particular listener.
Yeah, and I think what she's asking is she wants to find a company that would do that, not that she's in one now. And I'll tell you, the best way to do that, Google. So Google companies and put in those search terms and find out what they're doing, and that's where you should make your decision. And then once you find a company like that, what I would do is I would see if you could get an internship with them or a volunteer position and get some experience, because obviously you haven't had that experience and you're trying to make up for lost time. That may be a good way to break into it. Get a low-level job there and then prove your worth, get more involved, and move up. It seems like this is something that's really important to you, and I think it's worth your time, effort, and energy to do it. Anybody that's that motivated is going to be an asset to a company that's trying to help people. So we wish you luck in your career.
And to definitely think about the charity side, charities really do need good people. So there's different ways of doing it, volunteering, or even applying for some of the jobs as an advocate. But again, without knowing the psychology degree, and you sound like you're interested in the social media side too. Well, I certainly know, companies and certainly charities like Paladin, etc., are always looking for people to help who have experience, but it's not necessarily going to be on a paid basis as such. Some it's volunteering, it's internships, and others do have paid positions, so do have a look. And I wish you luck. So the next email that we received is actually about profiling techniques, and it's from somebody called Danielle, who said that she loves the show and really appreciates us doing it, and that her background is in research psychology. And she says, while I've never worked on it myself, I've always been fascinated by research on memory as it relates to eyewitness testimony. So she says that, and I've been totally pulled into the recent spate of attention to scrutinising the criminal justice system. So it's great to hear people with your expertise and background talking about these issues. I certainly feel, in particular, my perceptions of domestic abuse have changed, and this has been deeply enriched by the podcast. So thank you again for doing what you do. So the first bit is probably to talk about eyewitness testimony and say something about that. We've certainly seen it in many cases, Jim and I have, and obviously the research literature also bears this out, that it is incredibly unreliable when we're talking about crime and we're talking about cases.
Yeah, I think we have to, it is not, there's no question at all that eyewitness testimony is the least reliable type of testimony and evidence that is put into evidence at a trial, at a criminal trial. I'm sure it's at civil trials as well. But here's the thing. It's not all eyewitness testimony that's a problem. If you know somebody for a long period of time and you see them doing something and you're an eyewitness to a crime they've committed and you've been with them before, during, and after the crime, and you know it's that person, your eyewitness testimony is not uncredible. It is very credible. It can be very credible. But if you don't know somebody and you witness a traumatic event, the fact is that the way memory works, it can be overwhelmed. If there's gaps in memory, your brain tries to fill them with things that you expect to have happened. And Laura and I both have done research on memory, and we've worked literally between us thousands of cases that have to do with eyewitness testimony. And we have seen over and over and over again how inconsistent eyewitnesses to the exact same events can be about something that happened, very factual, right in front of their eyes. And so it is something that law enforcement has to deal with in almost every case. And it's something that you learn when you do thousands of cases over your career. You learn to weed out people who are actually overconfident and don't really have good information, and people who may not be very confident but actually can give really good information. It is something that you can only get by experience of doing it over and over and over again. But that's how we educate ourselves as law enforcement professionals. And with our education, experience, and training, we are able to sort of cut through some of the diversions that people will bring to a case because they believe they've seen something that they haven't. Many times you have to interview multiple witnesses, and you have to get it from different perspectives. And you can sometimes find videotape that will either corroborate or refute what witnesses will say, or you will find things that they claim happened, and in fact, they didn't happen at all. Not that they're intentionally lying to you, but because they actually believe what's in their memory, even though their memory is not an actual digital recreation of what happened in front of their eyes. The fact is that memories are stored in multiple different locations in your brain, and many times, if a piece of that memory is not really recorded, ever encoded in the first place, your brain will put something in that place based on your understanding, on your biases, and on your expectations. So I hope we've answered that question. I think it is something that will always be an issue in criminal investigations, but it's something that we have dealt with and still had very good prosecutions and convictions and acquittals when those were necessary. Hello, it's Jim Clemente and Francie Hakes with a special message about a new show that I'm hosting on Wondery called Locked Up Abroad. In each episode, people tell their harrowing stories of being convicted of crimes and jailed in foreign lands, or kidnapped and held hostage in war-torn countries.
These are definitely worst-case scenarios. They're truly frightening situations.
Yes, no best cases here.
But it is fascinating to hear how they manage to survive these ordeals.
In the first episode, Midnight Express, Billy Hayes tells us about being imprisoned in Turkey for smuggling hashish. Oliver Stone even made a movie about it. But that was the movie. This is the real story. I even had the chance to interview Billy Hayes recently, and he told me the whole story behind the story of how he escaped a Turkish prison. He even told me that he went back to Turkey years later. You have to hear his story to believe it.
And now, in his own words, here is Billy Hayes.
And I'd certainly say, from the research side, having a look at people like Dr. Becky Milne's research. She's an expert at Portsmouth University and has done a lot of work with the police around eyewitness testimony, and also Dr. Rachel Wilcox, who's now at University of Winchester, who's also an expert around eyewitness testimony and the police. So definitely have a look there at some of the academic research. She goes on to actually say that she wants to know more information, because she says the one thing that might be missing in the show is more information about where our analysis techniques come from and how you know that they work. How have your techniques been corroborated scientifically is one question. For example, in the Avery Dassey episodes, you base a lot of your analysis on different speech patterns, the types of details and people mentioned. What you said always made sense when you say it, but how have those things been established? Has
Okay.
anybody looked at these things in laboratory studies or scientifically examined cases to see how often analysis from profiling ended up being corroborated versus discredited through independent evidence?
Well, there's a lot of points there, so let's go back to the first one. So it might be missing from our show because that's not what our show is. We're not actually arguing to say this is the right thing to do, this is the right way to do an analysis. What we're saying is these are our analyses of the cases that we're addressing. Since you've asked the question, I'll try to give you an explanation of what we've done. First of all, my method of analysis comes from the National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime. It was created by Congress in the late 70s, and it is a epicenter for the study of criminal behavior, violent and sexual criminal behavior. We've had empirical research studies going for at least 2 decades in the Behavioral Analysis Unit and the National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime, from topics ranging from maternal filicide to serial killers and serial rapists behavior. We do have empirically based studies. We also have a tremendous amount of anecdotal, case-related information. The way we test it is not in a lab, because the fact is you can't get criminals, you can't get a control group, you can't get criminals who have not been convicted, who have not gone through a trial and had their rights protected through the course of a trial, to come in and admit to us in great, full, gory detail everything they've ever done in their life. We have to use what their behavior is at a crime scene, pre- and post-offense behavior as well, to interpret by an indirect psychological analysis or psychological autopsy or indirect personality assessment to try to determine the kind of person. We actually reverse engineer behavior that's exhibited at a crime and work back to the type of person who committed that crime. But how we know it works is because we've been doing this for 3 or 4 decades. My unit has. I've been doing it for about 3 decades. Laura's much younger than me, so she hasn't been doing it quite as long. But the fact is that we have done this over and over and over again, literally thousands of times every year. And the police officers keep coming back to us, the different agencies, federal, state, and local agencies, as well as international agencies, keep coming back to us because we've assisted them in the solution of crimes. That's how we know they work. This is the real world. This is not a laboratory. This is not a school. This is the real world. And we have to, the only way we can stay in business is if we are actually helping people solve crimes.
But there is something more, isn't there, Jim? I mean, I spent 3 months at the FBI and, of course, went through some of the similar training that the profilers do. So there's actually an academic base too, because you hear from all the experts in the field. So things like statement analysis, for example, and, the studies on veracity and deception. I was certainly trained in. I know you've been trained in it.
Yes.
And when we were talking about Jodie's interview in particular and Brendan Dassey's, we relied on our training and the things that we use in our day to day when we're analysing a statement, and when we're listening to a victim or a perpetrator, we're drawing on that knowledge too.
Yeah, and I wasn't addressing that part of the question yet, but yes, sure. And in fact, there are studies. And when I go out and teach law enforcement agencies and officers and lawyers and professionals in the crime field, I have PowerPoint presentations. When I do, for example, detection of deception lectures, I cite the different studies that have been done, which certainly you as a research scientist or psychologist can Google and find out all the studies that say that when there's other sensory and affective information, those are the kinds of things we see in truthful statements. This is not just based on our whim. This is based on, we are two professionals who have worked decades in these fields, who've risen to the top of our fields because of the work we've done, because of our education, because of our training, because of the thousands of cases we've worked. That's why we're here. That's why we're talking to you. We are sharing our thoughts and our opinions on these cases because we want to give people insight about these cases. Hopefully, people out there will learn something by listening to the way we analyze cases. If you want to learn more about how the work is done, you could read John Douglas's book, Mindhunter. That was one of the first, and it's a bestseller for many years, talking about how we analyze cases. Roy Hazelwood has a number of books out about that same topic. And there's plenty of information out there. We have tested our theories. We do empirical studies that we use to help train other law enforcement agencies and other justice professionals around the world. But the information itself is not available to any academic institution. It is not publicly available. We use it within law enforcement because it is law enforcement sensitive information. Although we are in a position to do this work professionally, we are not in a position to actually share all that information publicly. It's part of what law enforcement's job is, and we were honored and privileged to do this job.
So I think that answers sort of the next part of the question, which is saying, without knowing it, I don't know how much weight I should put on the further conclusions you draw based on those analyses, i.e. you made a compelling argument that Jodie was telling the truth about the abuse and then used that abuse as the premise for drawing compelling conclusions about Avery's personality and then using that as corroborating his potential guilt. And so I just want to make a comment about that. So one didn't follow to the other. That wasn't what we were saying. Certainly what we were saying of listening to Jodie's interview independently and analysing it is that Jim and I have listened to thousands and thousands of victims talk about abuse. And we use our techniques of statement analysis and understanding word placement and, the content in terms of how much someone talks about the detail of what went on with things that Jim just described, the sensory, the affective, spatial awareness, etc. So we bring all our research, the literature, the academic, we use it in practice every day. So when listening to Jodie, we understood that she was holding a mirror up to Steven Avery, and what she was saying felt authentic and like a truthful account. But we made it very clear that does not necessarily say that he was guilty of the murder of Teresa Halbech. What it tells us is that he was an abuser and he was abusive to multiple women, So we didn't take the next leap of faith. We've basically been taking it, it's like peeling an onion, taking it layer by layer to understand what's gone on in the entertainment documentary of Making a Murderer, to what other information is out there that hasn't been seen by viewers, and us analysing that. And, it's painstaking analysis and research, watching, listening, bringing our experiential and progressive bootstrapping, I'm going to call it, into our analysis and our understanding of what's gone on. So, with behaviour, there's never any absolutes, but you understand what's authentic when you've listened to lots of, and hundreds of thousands of victims talk from an abuse, a real abuse perspective. And we've also listened to those who have been deceptive and who've tried to manipulate the system, and those within it too. So we understand things from lots of different perspectives, and we draw our opinions based on all of those things.
Right. And when you have worked in this field for 20 or 30 years, as I have, and you have done thousands of cases over the course of your career, you actually educate your subconscious so that it actually is able to crunch data for you much faster than your conscious mind could ever do that. And so I'm not going to even try to explain to you why my brain will say this is relevant and that isn't, or why I will be able to determine whether somebody is being truthful or not truthful. The fact is, you can't do this with a machine. You can't do this on a checkboard or something. It's why people have to have decades of experience to be able to do what we do. If you don't want to believe our opinions, that's totally up to you. It's not a problem. What we're trying to do is educate the public, because we have had this experience, because we have done all these cases, and we think it's important that you don't just rely on what you see on TV or what you hear on the news, because we're actually giving you insights that are much deeper to than those things. We've told you a bunch of times where the actual production has edited out things or prevented you from actually knowing all the evidence. I just had a conversation with somebody who was actually a witness in the trial in the Steve Avery case, and when that person testified, they were on the stand for a day and a half. The documentary series showed just 2 minutes of testimony from that person. The first question being the actual answer that person gave. But the second question, when that person answered it, the answer was from a totally different question, but they wanted a different outcome. They wanted people to believe a certain thing, so they changed his answer. And that kind of thing is just unconscionable. That is not something a documentarian should ever do, yet it was part of telling their story. It was making entertainment and not giving you facts. We're trying to give you facts that underlie the entertainment. We're giving you an analysis and giving you tools upon which you can rely. That's hopefully what people are listening to this podcast for.
I mean, she goes on to say, knowing more about how you arrived at those earlier premises would help me know how confident to be in the subsequent conclusions. I've had similar reactions to certain statements in the OJ episodes. While I totally agree with your statements about OJ as a person, there have been times, particularly in the Nicole-focused episodes and in discussions about Johnny Cochran, when Laura and Jim have said things like, I'm sure that, or he probably, or she probably, and then made some logical conclusions based on those assertions. I know you're experts and I give you a ton of benefit of the doubt, but this show is your opportunity to minimise that doubt by telling us why you think those things. Well, I think we very clearly go through in each episode why we do think one thing rather than another, and we talk about what was in the show, but we also talk about other information. For example, we took apart the 911 and the letters because they didn't feature in the show. So, and we went through it line by line. So I think we are trying to show and give an insight to our analysis and how we understand what we're seeing, and we're trying to educate at the same time. So I'm not entirely sure what the point is there, other than, we sometimes say he probably or she probably, because Jim and I tend to deal in probabilities and possibilities.
Right. There's a major difference between a possibility and a probability, and this is what the distinction we make. When we say they probably did this, they probably did that, that's not something we're just throwing out there. What we're saying is it's more likely than not. probable cause is a standard that's 51% to 49%. We are talking about it's more likely than not. And because of that, because we can't know if we're not there, because we can't go back and turn back time and undo things that have been done before, what we tell you is it's more likely than not that this happened. And if we're using that as a building block, it's because we have a lot of reason to believe that based on their behavior. The reason why law enforcement officials come to us at all in the behavioral analysis sector is because there isn't adequate physical evidence or scientific evidence to convict somebody. When they come to us, or even in an investigation to find a suspect, when they come to us, it's because they don't have most of that other information. The fact is, what we're doing in this case, in the OJ case, for example, is we're supporting our conclusions by the behavior that we've seen. And we're saying that these are sort of tent pegs that hold up our theory of the case. Do we know absolutely certainly that it happened this way? No, but based on our experience and the thousands of cases we've seen and analyzed and taught on, this is what we firmly believe happened.
Yeah, and she goes on, in the OJ episodes, there's an additional layer of complexity because you're talking about the show and about the reality. And as an added layer of complexity, you're talking about the show on different levels, sometimes critiquing its contribution to the understanding of domestic violence in general, sometimes a separate question of how well it reflects the reality of this particular case, and sometimes analysing people's actions in the show and seeming to draw conclusions about reality without necessarily doing the fact-checking.
Well,
So
what this tells me is that you are a very good researcher. You are very good at assessing what's in front of you, and that's what you're very good at. And I believe that you are well trained in this area, that you're a professional in this area, and you're just going to have to believe that Laura and I are just as well trained and just as professional in our field of study. We're not going to be able to convey it to you in an hour podcast. We're not going to be able to melt our entire careers down to a few salient points and sound bites. That's the whole point of this podcast, to not do that, but to give you the benefit of the insights that we have, rather than trying to convince you that we are actually the kind of people you should be listening to about this.
I mean, the other point just to make here is that, yes, it's complex, isn't it?
It is.
I mean, but that's the real world, I'm afraid. It's complex. We are, trying to distill some very complicated and complex things down in terms of, the content of bringing it in lots of our knowledge and our expertise, looking at the show. We also do fact check, incidentally. I know there have been a couple of points where we were just double checking things, but we do fact check and we do understand, what was the original court transcript. When we do this, we actually do quite a lot of research before each podcast. And the other thing to say is that, yes, it's complex, but we know our listeners are up for it and are up to it. So all behaviour is complex and complicated. But she finishes off by saying, sometimes I wish it was just a little more clear how much of your analysis is based on the TV show without independent corroboration of the facts, or better yet, how much of your analysis was based on things that you had fact-checked and confirmed were accurate, which I think we do say. I make a point of saying, yes, that did happen in real life. That did happen. That is the
Certainly,
court
with
transcript.
respect to the OJ show, we did that all the time when we were actually dealing with the episodes. When we were dealing outside the episodes, when we did our Nicole-centric and our Ron-centric episodes, those were all facts. I mean, it wasn't fantasy at all. They barely even appeared in the entire dramatic series. So it wasn't anything about the series. We're talking about the facts that are out there that we could actually pick up, and that's what our assessments were based on.
And we did talk about the OJ scenes where only he knows,
Right.
certain things about what was said and conversations between him and Jason. So I thought we made that clear, but perhaps, you could provide us with specific examples, because I think it's very useful to talk from a specific point of view rather than a more general. And then she says, sorry for writing such a long email. These things might be really idiosyncratic to me, but I wanted to offer the feedback in case you found it valuable.
Well, we
Again,
do find it valuable. Thanks. I mean, to us, this is a discussion back and forth, and we have no problem. I mean, this is been our careers. We have no problem talking about this stuff, but it's not possible to actually give you. We can. It's not. It won't be entertaining at all if every time we say a fact, we then do a drill down into, okay, this fact, it started here, it came there, it went there, then we went
The
through this
academic
analysis.
reference for it, which, I mean, again, there are academic references to the things that we say, and
Everything that we're doing, we do have. There is research that supports what we do, but you're going to have to use your own experience, training, and education to do that, because we literally don't have time to do that for every single fact that we're going to talk about over the course of this podcast.
But a good reference point for the domestic violence side is the book that I co-authored with Sharon Stratton and Simon Letchford, and it is a policing domestic violence book published for Oxford University Press. So I would absolutely suggest that you have a look at that.
And I also worked on the FBI's behavioral analysis manual when I was in the behavioral analysis unit, but unfortunately that is not a document that's open to the public. That is actually a law enforcement sensitive document, so you can't reference that. But what I'm talking about is based on almost 40 years of institutional knowledge within the FBI's National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime, and there is no other institution like that in the world. We have more data than any scholastic institution in the world in terms of the crime that happens, violent crime, sexual crime, serial crime. So we
Mention the study, Jim. It might be worth just pointing out, because we've been talking about the studies on children that are missing
Right.
and who've been murdered.
Yeah, we
And
did a study back, I think in 2000, 1990 to 2000, 10 years of child abductions in the United States of America. And it's a statistical and relationship, age and gender-based study for the victims of child abduction. And we found that in the United States of America, over that 10-year period, 44% of the kids who were abducted and killed were killed within the first hour, 73% in the first 3 hours, 99% in the first 24 hours. That was an amazing revelation, because the practical application of that is that law enforcement, when we teach them this, when we put together the child abduction response plan, we were able to teach law enforcement officers that they can't wait, a few hours even. If a kid is missing, they need to immediately determine whether or not that kid was abducted. Because if that kid was abducted and they're going to end up being killed, they will most likely be dead within the first 3 hours. And that's an incredibly important statistic. Canada just finished doing another study which corroborates that almost to the percentage in Canada.
it's a smaller sample, but
Yes.
it gives, Jim and I were just talking about this, these are the things that Jim and I read and understand, but these are the sorts of studies that the FBI have done over time.
Yeah, we also did a study on the relationship between the offender and the victim, based on the gender, based on the age of the victim and what time in their life they are. What are the motivations based on that? We drill down into details. These are things that are just cemented in my brain because we actually did the research and then applied them in thousands of cases over the course of our careers. So you have to forgive us if we don't go back and actually drill down
Reference all of
and
these
reference
things.
it all the time. But I get it. You're an academic. You're a research psychologist. You love this stuff. This is just not the place for it. If you want to become an FBI profiler or get into the research arm of the National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime, I'm sure you would probably do a great job there. The next one is from Kay, and she says, I can't tell you how truly grateful I am for your amazing podcast. I could sing praises for countless paragraphs, but I'll skip that in favor of arriving at my point. Listening to your podcast has inspired me to change careers and devote my life to helping the victims and survivors of stalking. Thank you very much. But I have no idea where to begin, and I'm hoping you can help me start down this path. Laura?
Well, certainly there is currently only one national advocacy service, which is in the UK, and we have created an accredited university program for advocates. So again, it depends where you are in the world, but certainly that's the first university accredited program. It's a 3-week course. So again, going back to what we were talking about from our previous email, we do develop programs and courses too, where people are accredited, and there's different modules, hearing from specialist lawyers to I give an input on the DASH risk assessment model, for example, and an introduction to stalking. We have probation officers, and we have those who work with offenders and magistrates, and advocates from different walks of life, all who are on that course. So you have to pass the course to be accredited, and then you can work as what's called an ISAC, an independent stalking advocacy caseworker. So this is a new term. We do have independent domestic violence advisors and independent sexual violence advisors, but now we have very specific stalking caseworkers. So certainly we're hoping that we're going to have some over in the US, and I know that this particular person has contacted me, and I will give some more information out in terms of, just where we're going. But I would certainly say volunteering, getting some experience of working with victims is a really important part of this process. So volunteering at a domestic violence refuge or in a domestic violence charity, first of all, will be a very important first step to being exposed to those who are suffering and enduring abuse. And again, we see a high proportion of stalking cases within those types of cases. But of course, a caseworker who deals with stalking cases deals with all types of stalking. So it might be workplace, it might be predatory, it might be a stranger, it might be an ex-partner. So there are lots of different types of stalking cases. We have celebrity stalking cases as well, of course, or those who are high profile, who read the news, or they may not be a celebrity, but those who are under or in the media gaze as such. So there's lots of different types of stalking cases. And I think, if you go on, Jim, she talks about...
It's pretty amazing. She said that she realized that she wanted to do more in this area because an acquaintance of hers described to her what was clearly an abusive relationship, but that person had no awareness at all. Then this listener, Kay, suggested that she listen to episodes 8 to 10 of the podcast to hear our analysis of the behavior and mentality of abusers. So she did that, and she was positively stunned by what she heard. It validated that she was not, in fact, the crazy one in her relationship, and this listener was very elated to have played a small part in this revelation, and she realized that she was wasting her life in her current job. So although she has an advanced degree and a career, an accomplished career in an entirely different area, that our podcast has helped her realize that her efforts would be better spent serving those who could benefit from her life experiences. And then she goes on to say, like many of your listeners certainly do, I have an extensive history with this material, having been terrorized for years by a former partner. And this is something that is being more and more and more commonly brought up during the course of correspondence with us about this podcast. That many, many, many people have suffered at the hands of others, whether it be in domestic violence situations or stalking situations. So because this listener has had this experience, she really wants to go out and help other people. And that's a great thing.
It is. It's a fantastic thing. It's always sad to hear that somebody's had a personal experience and they can go on to becoming some of the best advocates. But of course, you have to deal with your potentially unresolved issues yourself before you can do that. And that's not always easy when you have to face up to the things that have happened to you. And I know certainly it's very easy, and we all do it as a coping mechanism, to put the things that affect us in a box and close the lid and hope that it won't ever resurface. But if we don't deal with those things, then they have a habit of coming up and surprising us at different times in our life course. And the one thing when you're working with abused and traumatized victims is they really would not benefit from somebody transferring their emotional abuse and concerns and things that they have felt, the shadows of abuse, onto them, because they actually need somebody who can be boundaried, can be constrained, can be very clear about the next steps. So I don't know where you are in terms of that process, but it does take time, and I would absolutely, suggest talking to a therapist, or being able to talk to someone first of all about any unresolved issues. If you've already done that and, now you're at a stage in your life where you do really want to give something back, certainly volunteering is a great thing. As I mentioned, not necessarily doing a lawyer's, becoming a lawyer. We talk about an advocate in the sense of an advisor, so that, when somebody's in trauma or in crisis, that they have somebody, a trained professional, and ours is a university accredited course. They're trained to be able to give all the options that within a criminal justice system that are available to a victim. The advocate is able to be the voice of the victim. They're a non-judgmental professional who listens to everything that's being said, who risk assesses the case. They're trained in safety and risk management, so they understand the things that need to be done, working with other professionals, all the multi-agency solutions that are available, and all the things that are available in the civil and not just the criminal, the civil process as well. So there's a lot to being an advocate. It's a very tough job. It can be very wearing, and we make sure our advocates are looked after, that they don't suffer from vicarious trauma. So there's a lot of clinical supervision that goes with it. And I think the first step is really getting some experience working with victims, domestic violence victims. And certainly, I know we're going to have further conversations just about, Paladin US being set up over here.
Yeah, and I think that the next part of the question is, it's kind of back to me. I assume that law school would be the best place to start, but I cannot find a program in the U.S. which emphasizes stalking. Are you aware of any that exist? Many law schools offer clinics in family violence, but I would personally enjoy a more specific concentration. Here's the thing. Why not be a leader? Why not go to one of those law schools that have a clinic in family violence and add a component about stalking? Become an expert in that field. Search for all those cases. Find law firms that have worked those cases. Find lawyers who have done this stuff. See if you can bring them into the school to do lectures. Create a program. Obviously, we need one. If there's nothing in the entire United States in a law school talking about stalking advocacy from a legal perspective, you might be the first one to do it, and you will help so many people down the road.
And that's if you're thinking about law as a profession rather than, the word advocate comes from the Latin, but actually how we use it in the UK is about being the voice of the victim. And most of our advocates, well, some do have a legal background actually, but majority of them have worked with domestic violence victims. Some of them are former police officers. So there's different ways of doing it, but we do have also a lawyer on our course who is a specialist in stalking, a specialist in domestic violence, a specialist in forced marriage, and so-called honour-based violence. So she was one of the first of her kind, really, in terms of getting that specialism. And she's somebody who also is the chair of Paladin. So somebody called Rachel Horman, she's won numerous awards, and she has been a trailblazer and somebody who has, forced her profession to look at stalking and to take it very seriously. And we're trying to ensure that other lawyers are trained to the same degree. So being a trailblazer would be fantastic, and it is hard work, but it's not a new area as such. This is an old problem, but unfortunately, there's a lot of professionals that do need training.
Yeah. And my professional career, I had a BS in chemistry and philosophy undergrad, and then went to law school. And I think that law school is a great place to learn how to basically think and argue and look at broadly at both sides of an issue, express yourself and analyze things in a very logical manner. So it's a training, it's a skill. Whether or not you're going to be a lawyer, I think it's a great training place for your mind.
It's a great foundation. The same as a psychology degree, it's a great foundation.
If that does interest you, then you should pursue it. But if it doesn't interest you, then I think you should try something in the advocacy area and try the things that Laura suggested, because that also could be a very good way to help people who have become the victims of stalking. Well, we hope that Laura and I have helped answer some of the questions that you have and given you some ideas about where to go and what to do in this field. These are very interesting questions for us. We're happy to answer them. We love the feedback. We love the back and forth. And we're going to do this again, because there are still many more questions out there. And we will get back to you as soon as we can with another episode of Real Crime Profile. For now, we're signing out. By the way, if you do know somebody who is in a situation where they're being stalked or domestically abused or the victim of any kind of violence, and they may not actually recognize it or think they need to get help, you might want them to listen to a few of our podcasts where we talk about these topics, and they may realize that they actually can get help and there is an alternative.
And we know that about 52% of victims don't realise that they're being abused. So it's a really important and helpful way, actually, for people to understand and identify what's happening to them. And the two other shout-outs that I just want to do before we close our question and answers is one for, I certainly mentioned our book, Policing Domestic Violence, with Sharon. I co-authored it with Sharon Stratton and Simon Letchford, two leading light police officers in the UK. But there's another fantastic book by someone called Professor Evan Stark, who's wrote a seminal book on coercive control. And it's certainly something that I use for reports for court and in a lot of reports that I write. And I would certainly suggest that you have a look at it if you have an interest in this area. And I also just want to point you in the direction, those who are asking how can they help. Paladin now have a Just Giving page, and it would mean the world to us to be able to reach more victims and those being abused. That people can go on the Just Giving page and can donate money. So please do have a look, www.paladinservice.co.uk.
Yeah, that's great. That would be great. Please help out if you can. And if you'd like to help us out and do us a favor, Wondery, our host, is doing a little survey about our listeners. So it just takes a few clicks. If you wouldn't mind going to Wondery.com and filling out the survey, that would be really great. Until next time, thank you for listening to Real Crime Profile.
For advice or support if you're experiencing stalking in the UK, you can contact Paladin National Stalking Advocacy Service on 0207 840 8960 or go on the website www.paladinservice.co.uk. If you're experiencing domestic violence, call the National Domestic Violence Helpline free phone 0800 2000 247. In the US, if you're experiencing domestic abuse and need advice, shelter, safety or counselling, call the Genesis 24-hour hotline 214-946-4357 or go on the website www.genesisshelter.org, or you can call the National Domestic Violence Hotline on 800 799 7233.
Real Crime Profile is produced and edited by Paul Francis Sullivan, engineered by Jacob Moose Molin. Music is composed and performed by Simba Sumba. Logo art by Rob Cohen. Real Crime Profile is produced and recorded at Empire Studios LA by XG Productions. Real Crime Profile is distributed by Wondery.
Ooh,